The rain fell in sheets, a relentless, silver curtain that turned the highway into a ribbon of black glass. Inside the Starlight Diner, the world was reduced to the hum of the old refrigerator, the rhythmic drumming on the roof, and the lonely hiss of the coffee machine. It was 3 a.m, the hour of ghosts and regrets, and Alara was the sole keeper of the light. For 6 years, her life had been measured in coffee pots brewed and tables wiped, a quiet routine that kept the silence at bay. She knew the particular groan of the vinyl on booth number 4 and the way the neon sign outside cast a pulsing, rose-colored glow on the chrome napkin dispensers when it wasn't flickering. Tonight, the storm had chased away even the usual late-night truckers, leaving the diner suspended in a pocket of profound stillness. Alara leaned against the counter, tracing a figure 8 on its worn formica surface with a damp cloth. She was thinking about nothing in particular, which was really a way of thinking about everything: the stack of bills on her small kitchen table, the brother who never called, the gnawing sense that her life had become a circle she couldn't break. The bell above the door was supposed to be a cheerful jingle, a bright announcement of company, but in the dead of night, it sounded like a single, jarring note of alarm. He didn't so much walk in as he was deposited by the storm, a shambling silhouette of dripping darkness against the sudden glare of the diner's lights. He closed the door with a quiet click that seemed to take the last of his strength, and for a moment, he just stood there, head bowed, water pooling around his worn boots. He was tall and lean, wrapped in a dark, heavy coat that had seen better decades. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood and a curtain of damp, black hair that clung to his skin. Alara straightened up, her professional waitress smile already forming out of habit. "Rough night out there. Come on in, grab a seat. Coffee's fresh." He didn't respond. He moved with a strange, disjointed grace, his body seeming to fight itself with every step. He slid into the booth farthest from the counter, the one tucked into the darkest corner, and kept his head down. Alara grabbed a menu, its plastic cover sticky from 1,000 hands, and walked over. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. He flinched at the sound, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He still didn't look up. A long, pale hand emerged from his sleeve and pushed the menu away. "Just water," he rasped. His voice was a low, gravelly thing, rough with disuse or pain. She nodded, retreating to the safety of her counter. There was something off about him, a coiled tension that made the hairs on her arms stand up. He wasn't just a traveler caught in the rain, he was running. From what, or whom, she couldn't guess, but the desperation clung to him like the damp. She filled a glass with ice and water, the clinking of the cubes abnormally loud, and brought it to his table. She set it down gently, and for the first time, he lifted his head just enough for her to see his eyes under the fall of his hair. They were dark, impossibly so, and held a weariness so profound it felt ancient. He murmured a thank you and she retreated again, busying herself with refilling the sugar shakers. She watched him in the reflection of the coffee machine. He drank the water in 3 long swallows, his throat working convulsively. His hands, she noticed, were trembling. They were elegant hands, long-fingered and starkly white against the dark wood of the table, but they were marred by dirt and a series of angry, red lines across the knuckles. He was hurt. For the next hour, he sat. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared into the empty water glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. Alara found herself holding her breath, the diner's familiar silence now charged with his presence. She started a fresh pot of coffee, the aroma filling the air, rich and earthy. It was a comforting smell, a scent of normalcy, and she hoped it might offer him some small measure of peace. It was when she was in the back, hauling a fresh bag of potatoes from the storeroom, that she heard it. A soft scraping sound from the kitchen, followed by a muffled curse. Her heart jumped into her throat. Her first thought was of the cash register, but she'd emptied it an hour ago. She crept to the swinging door, her hand closing around the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet she kept for stubborn bacon. Peeking through the round window, she saw him. He was by the cooling rack, his back to her. The dark coat was gone, discarded on the floor, revealing a simple, dark shirt stretched taut across a frame that was thin but not frail. He was stuffing day-old bread rolls into his pockets, his movements frantic and clumsy. He grabbed a half-eaten apple pie from the counter, his trembling hands smearing whipped cream across his wrist. He wasn't a robber. He was just hungry. Starving, by the looks of it. The sight broke something in her. The tension, the fear, it all dissolved into a wave of aching pity. This wasn't a threat. This was a man at the end of his rope. She pushed the door open. It swung inward with a soft whoosh. He froze, his entire body going rigid. He turned his head slowly, and this time, there were no shadows to hide his face. It was a face of sharp angles and pale, almost translucent skin, a face that belonged on an old coin or a forgotten statue. But it was his eyes that held her. They were wide with a kind of primal panic, the eyes of a cornered animal. A smear of flour was stark against his high cheekbone. He looked ready to bolt, to crash through the wall if he had to. Ilara kept her voice low and even, the way one might speak to a frightened bird. "You could have just asked." His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped along the sharp line of it. "I don't have any money." The admission was torn from him, laced with a bitter, ragged pride. "I didn't ask if you had money," she said, taking a small step forward. She set the heavy skillet down on the prep table with a soft thud. "I asked you to ask. There's a difference." He stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face for a trick, a trap. He saw none. He seemed to deflate, the fierce panic in his gaze softening into a vast, bottomless exhaustion. He looked at the mangled pie in his hand and then back at her, a flicker of shame crossing his features. "Sit down," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll make you something proper." He didn't move. He seemed incapable of it, caught between suspicion and a desperate, burgeoning hope. "Go on," she urged, gesturing with her head toward the dining area. "Go. Before you eat that pie and get sick. It's 3 days old." Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he walked back to his booth, leaving his discarded coat on the kitchen floor. Ilara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than pity. It was a shock of recognition. She knew that kind of bone-deep weariness, the feeling of running on nothing but fumes. She turned to the grill, her movements sure and practiced. She cracked eggs into a bowl, their shells making a sharp, clean sound. She sliced thick slabs of bacon and laid them on the hot surface, where they immediately began to sizzle and curl. The familiar actions were a balm, a way to make sense of the strange, impossible moment. She was just a waitress, making a meal for a hungry stranger. That was all. It had to be. She loaded a heavy ceramic plate with scrambled eggs, bacon, hash browns, and 2 thick slices of buttered toast. She poured a mug of coffee, black and strong, and carried the feast out to him. He was sitting exactly as he had been, rigid and watchful, but his eyes were fixed on the plate as she set it down. The aroma of the hot food rose between them, a tangible offering of warmth and sustenance. For a long moment, he just looked at it. Then, with a shaking hand, he picked up the fork. He ate with a desperate, methodical speed that spoke of days, maybe weeks, of hunger. He didn't speak, didn't look up, just focused on the food as if it were the only real thing in the world. Ilara slipped into the booth opposite him, nursing her own mug of coffee. She didn't press him. She just sat, offering him the silent companionship of her presence. It was enough. When he was finished, he pushed the clean plate away and finally, met her eyes directly. The gratitude in his gaze was so raw, so potent, it was like a physical blow. "Thank you," he said, and this time his voice was clearer, deeper, the roughness smoothed away by food and a moment's peace. "You were hungry," she said with a small shrug, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. A faint, ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was a sad, crooked thing, but it transformed his face, hinting at a beauty that his exhaustion had nearly erased. "I was," he admitted. "More than you know." He leaned back against the vinyl, a fraction of the tension leaving his shoulders. He seemed to be seeing her for the first time, not as a functionary or a potential threat, but as a person. "What is your name?" "Ilara." "Ilara," he repeated, the name a soft murmur on his tongue. "I am Kaylin." It was a simple exchange, a sharing of names in a rain-lashed diner at the edge of the world. But it felt significant, a tiny anchor in the storm of the night. Kaylin. The name suited him. It had the weight of stone and the whisper of wind. He looked past her, out the large plate glass window at the relentless rain. His expression shifted, the brief respite of peace vanishing, replaced by a familiar, hunted look. "I cannot stay," he said, more to himself than to her. "They will be looking." "They?" Elara asked, her curiosity overriding her caution. Before he could answer, a pair of impossibly bright lights cut through the downpour, sweeping across the diner's windows and bathing the interior in a harsh, sterile white. The light was wrong. It wasn't the warm, yellow glow of headlights, it was cold, blue-white, and utterly silent. A large, dark van, more armored vehicle than commercial transport, pulled into the empty parking lot. It had no markings, but it radiated an aura of methodical, ruthless authority. Kalen was on his feet in an instant, all traces of exhaustion burned away by a surge of pure adrenaline. The animal panic was back in his eyes, stark and terrifying. "They're here," he hissed, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "The luminaries." The name meant nothing to Elara, but the terror it invoked in him was contagious. Her blood went cold. Two figures emerged from the van, clad in dark, tactical gear. They carried long, metallic staves that glowed with the same cold, white light, casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the rain. "The back," Kalen commanded, his voice suddenly hard with an authority she didn't know he possessed. "Is there a storeroom? A place with no windows?" "The pantry," she stammered, pointing toward the kitchen. "It's small, but—" "Go." "Now," he said, grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron, his skin shockingly cold even through her sleeve. He propelled her toward the kitchen, his movements now fluid and impossibly fast. He snatched his discarded coat from the floor as they passed. "Get in. Do not make a sound. Do not, under any circumstances, let them see you with me." He practically shoved her into the small, dark pantry, a space that smelled of onions and dry pasta. He hesitated at the door, his dark eyes locking with hers. For a split second, the king or whatever he was vanished, and all she saw was the desperate man from the corner booth. "Thank you, Elara," he whispered, the words freighted with 1,000 unspoken things. Then he pulled the door shut, plunging her into absolute darkness. The bell on the front door chimed. The sound was no longer jarring, it was a death knell. Elara stood frozen in the pitch black of the pantry, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could hear the heavy, booted footsteps on the diner's checkered linoleum, the scrape of a stool being pulled out at the counter. A new voice cut through the air, sharp and imperious, a voice that expected to be obeyed. "We are looking for someone," the voice said, devoid of any warmth. "A fugitive. Tall, dark hair, wearing a coat like a shroud. He would look unwell. Have you seen him?" Elara pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the sound of her own breathing. She could hear the faint, steady drip of a leaky faucet in the kitchen sink, a sound she had never noticed before. It was the only thing that told her the world was still turning. She strained her ears, listening for Kalen, for any sign of where he had gone. But there was only the sound of the rain, the hum of the fridge, and the cold, demanding voice of the man at her counter. She waited for a response, for someone to answer the hunter. Then, with a jolt of pure terror, she realized who he was talking to. There was no one else in the diner. He was talking to her. And she was hiding in a pantry while a man who called himself a king hid somewhere in the shadows of her kitchen. Her simple, quiet life had not just been interrupted, it had been shattered. Pressed against the rough wood of the pantry door, Elara held her breath until her lungs burned. The silence from the main dining room stretched, thin and taut, a wire about to snap. She could picture the scene perfectly, the two figures in their dark gear, their glowing staves casting sterile pools of light on the floor, their eyes scanning every corner. And the man at the counter, the one with the cold voice, waiting for her answer. Where was Kalen? Had he slipped out the back? Was he crouched behind the grill, holding his breath just as she was? The seconds dripped by, each one a small eternity. Finally, the silence was broken by her own voice, or a shaky, thin version of it that she barely recognized. "Be right out," she called, forcing a note of normalcy into the words. She had to go out there. Hiding was an admission of guilt. She pushed the pantry door open, her hand trembling so badly she could barely grip the knob. She squinted against the diner's familiar light, which now seemed harsh and interrogating. The two men were there, just as she'd imagined. One stood by the door, a silent, imposing sentinel. The other sat at the counter, his back to her. He didn't turn as she emerged from the kitchen. He simply watched her reflection in the polished chrome of the coffee machine. "Took you long enough," he said. His voice was like chipping ice. "Busy night?" The question was a sneer. "Just me tonight," Elara replied, her voice gaining a little strength. She moved behind the counter, the solid barrier a small comfort. It was her territory. Storm keeps most folks away. "Coffee." The offer was automatic, a reflex ingrained by years of service. The man finally swiveled on his stool to face her. He was younger than his voice suggested, with a severe, handsome face and eyes the color of a winter sky. A pale, jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his mouth in a permanent, faint scowl. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking through her, his gaze sweeping the diner, cataloguing every detail, every shadow. "We don't have time for coffee," he said, his eyes lingering for a moment on the booth in the far corner where Kaylin had Saturday. "I'll ask you again." A man. Tall. Pale. "Looks like he's been dragged through hell and back. Did he come in here?" Elara's mind raced. Kaylin had used the word he had called them luminaries. These men hunted him. To help him was to make herself their enemy. But the image of his face when she'd given him the plate of food, the raw, desperate gratitude, was burned into her mind. She had already made her choice. "A few truckers came through earlier, before the storm got bad," she said, her voice steady now. She wiped a clean spot on the counter, her movements deliberately slow and casual. "No one fitting that description." "Sorry." The man's cold eyes narrowed, boring into her. He could tell she was lying. She was sure of it. She could feel the lie hanging in the air between them, a fragile, shimmering thing he could shatter with a word. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze dropping to the plate and mug she had cleared from Kaylin's table, now sitting in the wash basin behind her. "You washed these recently," he stated. It wasn't a question. "One plate. One mug." Elara's heart seized. "I get hungry on the late shift," she said, the lie coming more easily this time. "It's a long night." He smiled, a humorless stretching of his lips that didn't touch his eyes. "Of course." A long night. He tapped a finger on the counter, a rhythmic, irritating sound. Tap. 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 "Our quarry is dangerous. He's a creature of shadow, a blight on the natural order. He preys on the kindness of people like you. He will use you, drain you, and discard the husk. Harboring him is not an act of charity. It is suicide." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to create fear and doubt. Elara met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I told you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I haven't seen anyone." The man, the luminary, held her gaze for another long moment, a silent battle of wills fought across the worn counter. She felt as if he were trying to peel back the layers of her thoughts, to see the image of Kaylin hiding in her kitchen. But she held firm, her expression a placid mask, her mind a blank wall. He finally broke contact, sighing with theatrical disappointment. A pity he stood, his movements economical and precise. "Jorik," he called to the man at the door. "Check the back." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Elara's composure. "Hey," she said, her voice rising in protest. "That's my kitchen. You can't just." "We can," the leader said, cutting her off with chilling finality. He turned back to her, his face inches from hers across the counter. "And we will. If we find him, we will be merciful and assume he coerced you. If we find evidence that you helped him willingly, our mercy has its limits." The second man, Jorik, moved from the door, his heavy boots making no sound on the floor. He walked toward the swinging kitchen door, his glowing staff held ready. Elara's breath caught in her throat. It was over. They would find him. What would they do to him? What would they do to her? Jorik pushed through the door. Elara watched, helpless, as his light flooded her small, familiar kitchen. She heard him moving around, the clatter of a pan, the opening of the walk-in freezer. The leader stayed at the counter, his eyes fixed on her, watching for any flicker of fear, any sign that his man was getting close. Then came the sound of the pantry door being wrenched open. Ilara flinched, a small, involuntary movement she couldn't suppress. The leader's cold smile widened. He had seen it. "There now," he murmured. "Was that so hard?" But from the kitchen, there was only silence. No shout of discovery, no sound of a struggle. Jorik reappeared in the doorway a moment later, shaking his head. "The place is empty," he reported. "Back door's unlocked, but it looks like it hasn't been opened in years. Rusted shut." "He's not here." Ilara stared, her mind reeling. "Empty? How could it be empty? She had put him in there herself. She had shut the door." The leader's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He looked from Jorik to Ilara, his brow furrowed in thought. He seemed to sense that something was wrong, that a piece of the puzzle was missing, but he couldn't place it. "He passed this way," the leader insisted, more to himself than to anyone else. The trail was strong. It ended here. He ran a hand over his severe haircut, a gesture of frustration. The storm must be interfering with the tracking. He could have doubled back. He gave the diner one last, sweeping glance, his eyes filled with suspicion and distaste. "Let's go. We'll circle back and check the access roads." Jorik nodded, and the two of them moved to the door. Before leaving, the leader paused and looked back at Ilara. "If you see him," he said, his voice a low threat, "know that you are looking at a walking plague. Your compassion is a weakness he will exploit. Remember that." Then they were gone, swallowed by the rain and the night. The blinding white light of their van swept across the parking lot and disappeared down the highway, leaving the diner in its familiar, rose-tinted glow. The silence they left behind was heavier, more profound than before. Ilara sagged against the counter, her legs suddenly weak. She felt dizzy, nauseous. She had lied to men who carried weapons of light and spoke of plagues, men who hunted other men. She had risked everything for a stranger who stole bread from her kitchen. She stumbled into the kitchen, her eyes going immediately to the pantry. The door was ajar, swinging slightly. She crept toward it, her heart pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm. She pushed it open. The small space was just as Jorik had said. Empty. Sacks of flour, boxes of pasta, strings of onions. No sign of Kaelin. "How?" she whispered to the empty room. A soft sound from above made her gasp and jump back. She looked up. High on the wall, near the ceiling, was a small ventilation grate, its cover slightly askew. It was impossibly high, and the grate itself was no bigger than a dinner plate. No man could have fit through there. It was impossible. A useful trick. The voice came from directly behind her. Ilara cried out and spun around, her hand flying to her chest. Kaelin was standing by the dishwashing station, not a foot away. He hadn't been there a second ago. He had made no sound. He was just there, as if he had coalesced from the shadows themselves. He was holding his coat, and his face was grim, his eyes fixed on the front windows where the hunter's van had been. "I apologize for the fright," he said, his voice low and strained. "It was necessary. The pantry, the vent." She stammered, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with the laws of physics. "As I said. A useful trick," he replied, offering no further explanation. He looked at her, and the hardness in his face softened. "You lied for me. You faced them. Why?" Ilara shook her head, trying to clear it. I don't know. They were going to hurt you. They were going to kill me," he corrected her, his voice flat and devoid of self-pity. "And they would have hurt you for getting in their way. You took a great risk for a thief. You were hungry," she repeated, the simple, undeniable truth of it. It was the only thing that made sense in this whole insane night. He took a step closer. The air around him seemed to shimmer, to grow colder. He was different now. The desperate, hungry man was gone, replaced by something older, more powerful, and infinitely more dangerous. The authority she had glimpsed earlier was now a palpable aura around him. "My thanks are insufficient for what you have done, Ilara," he said, his voice resonating in the small kitchen. "You have bought me time. precious time. But you have also placed yourself in grave danger. They will not forget this diner. They will not forget your face. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to show her his hand. He turned it over. A deep, angry burn marred his palm, the skin blistered and red. It was a fresh wound. What happened? She whispered, her eyes wide. Jorik's staff, Kalen said, his lip curling in a slight snarl. He brushed the pantry door with it as he passed. A warding gesture. They coat their weapons in silver. Silver. The word hung in the air. Ilara looked from the burn on his hand to his pale face, his dark eyes, his unnatural stillness. The strange coldness of his skin when he'd grabbed her arm. His impossible speed. His appearance from nowhere. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture that her rational mind refused to accept. "What are you?" she breathed, the question a fragile puff of air. Kalen held her gaze, his own dark and filled with a sorrow that seemed as deep as the night outside. "I am a king without a kingdom," he said softly. "A shepherd whose flock has been scattered. And I am what they hunt. I am a vampire." The word landed in the quiet kitchen with the force of a physical blow. Vampire. A creature of myth, of cheap novels and late-night movies. It was absurd, impossible. But as she looked at him, at the ancient weariness in his eyes, the predatory grace in his stillness, the silver burn on his hand, a terrifying, undeniable truth settled in her soul. He was telling the truth. Ilara didn't scream. She didn't run. The revelation was too large, too world-altering, to be processed with a simple, animal reaction. Instead, a strange calm descended upon her. It was the calm of a person who has fallen from a great height and has nothing left to do but watch the ground approach. She felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her chest. Of course. Of course, the first interesting thing to happen to her in 6 years was a vampire king hiding from magical zealots in her pantry. It made a bizarre kind of sense. She took a slow, deliberate breath. "Okay," she said. The single word felt ridiculously inadequate. Kalen watched her, his expression unreadable. He had clearly expected a different reaction: fear, revulsion, panic. Her quiet acceptance seemed to unbalance him more than any scream could have. "Okay," he repeated, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "Okay," she affirmed, nodding slowly. She gestured to the angry burn on his palm. "That looks like it hurts. I have a first aid kit in the office." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her legs feeling strangely disconnected from her body. She was moving on autopilot, her mind still trying to stretch itself around the new shape of reality. Vampires were real. And one of them was currently standing by her dishwashing station. She returned with a small, white plastic box and set it on the prep table. She opened it, the contents neat and orderly: bandages, antiseptic wipes, gauze. She worked in a kitchen. Cuts and burns were a daily reality. This, however, was new. "Give me your hand," she said, her voice betraying only a slight tremor. He hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand. She took it gently. His skin was as cold as she remembered, like marble that had been left out in the winter. It was unnervingly smooth, flawless except for the raw, weeping burn. She cleaned it with an antiseptic wipe, her touch surprisingly steady. He hissed in pain as the alcohol touched the wound, a sharp intake of breath. "Sorry," she murmured. "It is the silver," he explained through gritted teeth. "It is a poison to my kind. It burns in a way that fire cannot." She worked in silence, carefully applying a soothing salve and wrapping his hand in clean, white gauze. Her fingers brushed against his, and a strange jolt, a current of cold energy, passed between them. He flinched, pulling his hand back slightly, but she held on, her grip firm and reassuring as she secured the bandage. The act was intimate, a small, quiet moment of care in the midst of chaos and impossibility. She was bandaging the hand of a mythical creature as if he were a line cook who'd burned himself on the grill. When she was done, she released him. He flexed his fingers, his dark eyes fixed on the white bandage against his pale skin. "No one has tended to my wounds in a very long time," he said softly, looking at her with an expression of profound, bewildered gratitude. "My own court physicians would sooner let me suffer than risk touching me." "Why?" "Fear," he said simply. It is the curse of kings, and doubly so for a king of my nature. They fear what I am. They serve the power, not the man. A wave of loneliness emanated from him that was so potent, so achingly familiar, that it resonated deep within her own soul. The isolation of his throne, the isolation of her counter, perhaps they weren't so different after all. You need to get out of here, she said, her voice practical again. They said they'd be back. I know, he said, his gaze turning once more to the rain-streaked windows. But the storm hides me. Their tracking methods rely on celestial alignments, the sun, the moon. This cloud cover is a blessing. But it will not last forever. Dawn is my enemy, and it is only a few hours away. Dawn. The classic vulnerability. Where will you go? She asked. He gave a short, bitter laugh. I have been asking myself that same question for 3 weeks. I have been moving north, toward the colder lands where the nights are longer. I have allies there, or I hope I do. Alliances are fickle things when a king is in exile. He looked around the small, warm diner, at the worn vinyl booths and the comforting glow of the coffee machine. This place, it is an anchor in the storm. For a few hours, I was not hunted. I was not a king. I was just a man, being offered a kindness he did not deserve. You were hungry, she said again, the words becoming a refrain, a simple truth to hold on to. Everyone deserves to eat. His eyes met hers, and in their dark depths, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. It was not just gratitude. It was something deeper, a recognition, a connection forged in the crucible of this strange night. They will question you again, Elara, he warned, his voice grave. The one with the scar, his name is Malachi. He is the leader of this particular sect of luminaries. He is relentless, and he is clever. He knows you lied. When the sun rises, he will return, and his questions will not be so gentle. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. What should I do? You should leave, he said immediately. Pack what you can carry, take the money from your register, and drive as far away from here as you can. Your life as you know it is over. I am sorry for that. I have brought my war to your door, and I have no way to repay you for it. Leave. Leave the diner, her small apartment, the only life she had known for 6 years. It was a terrifying thought. But the alternative, facing Malachi and his glowing staves alone, was infinitely worse. And you, she asked. Where will you go right now? There is an abandoned rail yard 2 miles east of here. I saw it on my way. I can find shelter there, a place to hide from the sun. It will suffice until nightfall. He looked down at his bandaged hand. You have given me a great deal, Elara. Food. Shelter. A moment of peace. And this he gestured with his hand. A kindness I will not forget. He moved toward the kitchen's back door, the one Jorik had declared rusted shut. He placed his uninjured hand on the handle, and with a faint, groaning screech of tortured metal, the rusted lock broke and the door swung open, revealing the rain-soaked alley behind the diner. He paused in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the storm. Be safe, Elara, he said, his voice a low murmur that was nearly lost in the sound of the rain. And then he was gone, dissolving into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. Elara was left alone in the humming silence of her kitchen, the smell of rain and ozone filling the air. She looked at the first aid kit on the counter, the empty plate in the sink, the swinging door to the dining room. It had all happened. It was all real. For a long moment, she stood frozen. Leave. He had told her to leave. He was right. Malachi would be back. Her quiet, circular life had been broken, and she could never go back to it. The thought should have terrified her. And it did. But underneath the fear was a strange, thrilling flicker of something else. Freedom. She walked to the front of the diner and flipped the sign on the door from open to closed. She emptied the cash register, stuffing the worn bills into her pocket. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She went into the small office, a room barely bigger than the pantry, and grabbed her worn leather jacket and her car keys from the hook on the wall. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it was with a nervous, electric energy. She paused, looking around the empty diner. This small, fluorescent-lit box had been her entire world. It had been a shelter, a routine, a prison. Now she was leaving it behind. She didn't know where she was going, or what she would do. She only knew she couldn't stay. As she walked toward the door, her eyes fell on the half-eaten apple pie Kaylin had tried to steal. On an impulse, she grabbed it, along with a plastic fork. She locked the diner door behind her, the click of the lock feeling unnervingly final. The rain had lessened to a fine drizzle, and the air was cold and clean. She got into her old, beat-up sedan, the engine turning over with a reluctant cough. She didn't turn onto the highway. Instead, she turned onto the small access road that ran behind the diner, heading east. Toward the abandoned rail yard. She didn't know why she was doing it. It was insane. It was dangerous. He was a vampire. He was a king. He was hunted by fanatics with silver-laced weapons. And she was a waitress with a stolen pie and a half-tank of gas. But she couldn't just leave him. She couldn't shake the image of his eyes, the profound loneliness she had seen there. She had offered him a meal. Perhaps she could offer him something more. A ride. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, but for the first time in a very long time, Ilara felt like she was moving forward. The rail yard was a skeletal ruin, a graveyard of forgotten industry. Rusted boxcars sat silently on tracks that disappeared into weeds and mud, their sides covered in faded graffiti. A massive, derelict warehouse loomed at the far end, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the drizzling dawn. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the impenetrable black of night softening to a bruised purple and grey. Ilara parked her car behind a crumbling brick wall, out of sight from the main road. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. She sat for a long moment, the pie box resting on the passenger seat, and wondered if she had lost her mind. She was chasing after a creature of the night, a fugitive king, with nothing to offer but a beat-up car and some dessert. She got out, pulling her jacket tighter against the damp chill. The air smelled of wet earth, rust, and decay. "Kaylin," she called out, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast, quiet space. There was no answer but the drip of water from a rusted gutter. She walked slowly, cautiously, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. She peered into the dark interiors of the boxcars, seeing nothing but shadows and debris. He had to be here somewhere. He had said he needed to hide from the sun, and the sun was coming. She made her way toward the large warehouse. A section of the corrugated metal wall had been torn away, creating a dark, gaping entrance. It looked like the mouth of some great, sleeping beast. Stepping inside was like entering another world. The air was thick with the dust of decades, and the faint light from outside struggled to pierce the gloom. Long, silent conveyor belts snaked through the cavernous space, and hulking, sheet-draped machinery stood like sleeping giants. "Kaylin," she called again, her voice echoing in the immense emptiness. A flicker of movement in the deepest shadows caught her eye. He emerged from behind a towering stack of rotting pallets, moving with the silent grace she was beginning to recognize. He was no longer just a man in a dark coat. In the deep shadows of the warehouse, he seemed more himself, more real. The faint light caught the sharp planes of his face, the startling pallor of his skin. "You should not have come," he said, his voice a low rumble. There was no anger in it, only a deep, weary concern. "I told you to leave. Malachi will be looking for you. He'll be looking for me on the highway, heading west or south," she countered, taking a few steps closer. "He won't think to look for me 2 miles east." In a place like this she held up the pie box. "I brought you this. The part you didn't try to steal." He stared at the box, then at her, a flicker of disbelief in his dark eyes. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips this time. It was a startlingly beautiful thing, a brief flash of light in the gloom. "Ilara," he murmured, shaking his head slightly. "You are a constant source of astonishment." "I figured you might still be hungry," she said with a shrug, trying to appear more casual than she felt. Her heart was hammering. "And I thought you might need a ride." His smile faded, replaced by a somber gravity. "A ride to where? My world is not a place for someone like you. It is a world of shadows, of ancient hatreds and endless conflict. The luminaries are only one of my enemies." "Sounds like you could use a friend, then," she said simply. He was silent for a long time, studying her. She felt his gaze like a physical touch, as if he could see every fear, every hope, every lonely year she had spent pouring coffee and wiping down counters. "Why?" he finally asked, the question raw and vulnerable. "Why are you doing this? You know what I am." "I know you were hungry," she said, her voice soft but certain. "I know you were hurt. I know you were grateful. The rest, it's just details. Right now, all I see is someone who needs help." She took another step closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the strange cold that radiated from his body. "You told me my life as I knew it was over. You were right. So, I get to decide what the new one looks like. And I've decided I don't want to spend it running away, alone. I'd rather spend it running toward something. Even if it's dangerous." His expression was one of utter turmoil. He looked from her earnest face to the growing light in the eastern sky, a visible representation of his deadline. The rising sun was painting the edges of the broken warehouse entrance in shades of rose and gold. For him, it was not a symbol of hope, but a promise of pain and death. "The sun," he whispered, a note of real fear in his voice. He instinctively recoiled deeper into the shadows. "I cannot be caught in the light." "Then we need to find you a better place to hide than this," she said, her mind working quickly. "My car's not safe. They'll be looking for it. We need a vehicle they won't notice. Something that can get you far away from here before tonight." She looked around the rail yard. Her eyes landed on a maintenance truck parked near a small, dilapidated shed, its tires half flat, a thick layer of grime and rust covering its body. It looked like it hadn't moved in a decade. "What about that?" she asked, pointing. Kaelin followed her gaze. "It is ancient. It will not run." "Maybe," she said, a determined glint in her eye. "But my brother was a mechanic. He taught me a few things." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the rail yard, they worked. Ilara, armed with a small toolkit she kept in her trunk, popped the hood of the old truck. It was a mess of rusted parts and frayed wires, but the engine block itself looked solid. Kaelin watched from the deep shade of the warehouse, a silent, anxious observer. He was a king, a creature of immense power, but in the face of a combustion engine and the coming day, he was utterly helpless. It was a strange reversal of roles. He was the one in need of rescue. Ilara worked with a focused intensity he had not seen before. This was her element, a world of practical problems and tangible solutions. She cleaned the spark plugs, bypassed a faulty ignition wire, and siphoned gas from her own car into the truck's thirsty tank. Her hands, which had so gently bandaged his own, were now deft and capable, stained with grease and grime. The sun was fully above the horizon now, a brilliant, unforgiving eye in the sky. Kaelin retreated to the absolute blackness at the very back of the warehouse, where no stray beam of light could touch him. The light that crept in through the cracks in the walls was painful to him, an irritating buzz against his senses. He could feel its heat, a threat that promised annihilation. He watched Ilara through the gloom, a small, determined figure in the bright, hostile world outside. She was courage and warmth and life itself, everything he was not. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she slid into the driver's seat of the truck and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. She tried again. A grinding noise, then silence. Kaelin felt a pang of despair. It was hopeless. He was trapped. But Ilara didn't give up. She got out, made another adjustment under the hood, and tried a third time. This time, with a roar of protest and a cloud of black smoke, the engine caught. It rattled and shook, a chorus of mechanical complaints, but it was running. Ilara leaned out the window, a triumphant, grease-smudged grin on her face. "We have a ride," she shouted, her voice echoing slightly in the yard. The problem, Kaelin knew, was getting to it. The truck was parked in the full, glorious light of the morning sun. The 50 feet of open ground between the warehouse and the truck might as well have been 1,000 miles. "I cannot cross the open ground," he called out, his voice tight. "The sun." Ilara's grin faded as she understood. She looked at the open space, then back at the truck. She chewed on her lip, thinking. Her eyes scanned the yard, landing on a pile of large, heavy tarps that had once been used to cover the boxcars. I have an idea, she said. A few minutes later, she was wresting one of the massive, stiff tarps from the pile. It was heavy canvas, thick with grime and smelling of mildew, but it was opaque. She dragged it to the entrance of the warehouse. It's not perfect, she said, breathing heavily from the effort. But it might work. If we're fast. Kalen emerged from the deepest shadows, his face a pale mask of apprehension. He looked at the top, then at the sunlight that lay like a golden barrier just beyond the threshold. He could feel its searing touch on his mind, a primal, instinctual terror that screamed at him to retreat. To trust her was to walk willingly toward the thing he feared most. Trust me, Allure said, as if reading his thoughts. She held out her hand. He looked at her hand, then into her eyes. He saw no fear there, only determination and a fierce, protective resolve. He had commanded armies, ruled over a court of ancient and powerful beings, and bent nations to his will. But in that moment, he put his fate entirely into the hands of a human waitress from a roadside diner. He took her hand. Her skin was warm, a startling contrast to his own, a small point of life and heat in his cold existence. Together, she said. She threw one end of the heavy top over him, creating a makeshift, moving tent. He hunched underneath it, plunged into a suffocating, musty darkness. He could hear Alure's steady breathing beside him, feel the reassuring grip of her hand in his. Ready? She asked. He gave a short, sharp nod, his throat too tight to speak. Go. They moved out of the warehouse and into the light. Even through the thick canvas, Kalen could feel the sun's oppressive power. It wasn't a physical heat so much as a metaphysical one, an energy that was fundamentally hostile to his very being. His skin prickled, and a wave of weakness washed over him. He stumbled, his legs suddenly feeling like lead. Alure's grip tightened on his hand. Stay with me, she urged, her voice strained with the effort of holding the heavy top and pulling him along. We're almost there. Just a few more steps. He focused on the warmth of her hand, on the sound of her voice, using it as an anchor against the encroaching weakness. It was the longest 50 feet of his long, long life. Every instinct screamed at him to flee back into the shadows, but he fought it, trusting her. They reached the truck. Allure fumbled with the passenger door, wrenched it open, and practically shoved him inside. He collapsed onto the seat, pulling the top in after him. She slammed the door shut, and he was safe, enclosed in the metal and glass of the truck's cab. He was shaking, his body slick with a cold sweat. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the back of his hand where a sliver of sunlight had touched it through a gap in the top. The skin was red and angry, a fresh burn. Allure scrambled into the driver's seat, her face pale, her chest heaving. She threw the rattling truck into gear, and with a lurch, they were moving. They bumped and jolted down the overgrown access road, leaving the rail yard behind. Kalen huddled on the floor of the cab, wrapped in the filthy top, trying to calm the frantic, terrified beating of his own dead heart. He had survived. She had saved him. They drove for hours, sticking to back roads and forgotten highways. Allure drove with a steady, competent focus, her eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. Kalen remained on the floor, hidden from view. The enclosed space of the truck's cab became their whole world. It smelled of old vinyl, gasoline, and the faint, metallic scent of Kalen's fear. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden rays across the landscape, Kalen felt his strength returning. The weakness receded, replaced by the familiar, quiet power that hummed beneath his skin. He sat up, pushing the top away. We should stop soon, he said, his voice stronger now. Find a place to rest until full dark. Allure nodded, her shoulders slumping with accumulated exhaustion. She had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight. She pulled the truck onto a dirt track that led into a dense forest and killed the engine. The sudden silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. I can't believe we did that, she whispered. I can't believe you did that, Kalen corrected her gently. He looked at her, truly looked at her, in the soft, fading light. Her hair was a mess, her face was smudged with grease, and she looked more tired than he had ever seen her. And he thought she was the most magnificent creature he had ever encountered. You were fearless, he said, the word inadequate. She opened her eyes and turned to him, a weary smile on her face. I was terrified. I've been terrified since you walked into my diner. I just got tired of letting it stop me. He reached out, his bandaged hand hovering for a moment before he gently brushed a smudge of grease from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a shockwave through both of them. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a recognition of the new, unspoken thing that had grown between them in the darkness and the fear. Ilara, he began, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know how to finish. How to explain the gratitude, the awe, the burgeoning affection he felt for this impossible human. How could he tell her that in less than a day, she had shown him more loyalty and courage than he had seen in centuries? She simply looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. She understood. She didn't need the words. Get some sleep, she said softly. I'll take the first watch. No, he said, his voice firm. The night is mine. You need to rest. You've earned it. She was too tired to argue. She curled up on the bench seat, using her jacket as a pillow, and was asleep in minutes. Kaelan watched over her as darkness fell completely, blanketing the forest in a shroud of silver moonlight and deep, quiet shadows. He was the king of this domain, a creature of the night, yet he had never felt more humbled. He slipped out of the truck, the cool night air a balm on his skin. He moved to the edge of the trees, his senses expanding, tasting the air, listening to the heartbeat of the forest. He was still hunted. He was still an exile. But he was no longer alone. He looked back at the rusted truck, a small, fragile shell of civilization in the vast wilderness. Inside, Ilara slept, the woman who had faced down his enemies, fixed a broken engine, and dragged him through the sun. She had saved his life. And he was beginning to suspect she might just save his soul, too. A king without a kingdom, he had called himself. But perhaps, he thought, as he watched over the sleeping woman in the truck, he had just found the first citizen of a new one.